security work in the real world? There you go, Jeff.
Thank you for that outstanding introduction. Hey, it's great to be back here again at BSidesSF San Francisco. Glad you came out to hear me talk. This is more, hopefully, a discussion starter. That's me. Contact information is pretty much my Twitter handle right now. I thought about putting my email address up there, and then I thought I wouldn't do it. Quick audience survey. How many people think the answer to the question is yes? Does DoD security work in the real world? Nobody's going to go out there on a limb. How many people think the answer is no? How many people are just waiting for me to tell you? And how many people would rather get this party started and move on to the bar? All right. This talk kind of comes from my background, so I have to tell a story about myself. I've been around the security business for quite a long time, going on 34 years. Spent quite a bit of time in the Department of Defense. I've been out in the commercial world for the last 20 years or so. I actually did PCI as a QSA for 10 years. Go ahead and say something funny. Anyone? Ever hear of a company called TJX Companies? Ever heard that they got breached? I was their QSA for 6 years, after the breach, not before. Okay. I helped them clean up. I spent a couple years working for a vulnerability management company who I shall not name because I'm no longer with them, but you can figure it out. And I actually got started in this business in 1984, strangely enough. I thought that was kind of appropriate to bring out today. My very first job, I was a summer intern. I was getting ready for my senior year of college, and I went to work for a now defunct agency called the Naval Surface Weapons Center. Why is that thing moving? Because there's wind. My job for the summer was I was working for a physicist that was an expert in anti-submarine warfare. In fact, when I went to work for him, he said, the best way to describe what it is we do is to read this book that just came out. So my first week on the job, I got to read a book, The Hunt for Red October. Because, strangely enough, because we could get into open source collection, which is probably another talk, a lot of really good information in that book about what really went on in terms of anti-submarine warfare. But he had this filing cabinet filled with research material, and he had gotten some money and bought one of these brand newfangled things called a computer, a desktop PC. Notice it didn't have a hard drive. And he wanted me to play around for the summer of building some sort of simple database with simple search criteria. So I had to go through this whole filing cabinet and find each document, read it, write the title down, write down, all the pertinent information, read enough of the document to get some keywords so I could start building up a keyword search. And that was my summer job. That was kind of cool. I was young, naive, and I got introduced to data security because I broke a rule. I came in one morning and I opened up the safe, and there was a little note in it because there's a security guard that walks around in the night trying all the doors, and he was able to get into the safe because how many people do Lockpick Village know a little bit about combination locks? If you don't spin those things far enough, they don't actually lock, so guilty. So I was young, I was naive, I was thinking, well, what's the big deal? I'm in a locked room, I'm in a locked office inside of a locked building. There's a fence around the building. You have to go through some sort of checkpoint, guard desk. There's a locked door into the office, and there's guards that walk around. So what's the big deal if I left the safe unlocked? Hold that thought. As I want to get into talking about does DoD level security work in the real world, I think it's appropriate first to sort of level set on what we're talking about, because what you think DoD level security is may not be what I think DoD level security is. I think a lot of people, when they hear DoD level security, think it's the ultimate highest degree of security. Don't laugh if you know people in the military or in the government. But is that a perception? I think the answer is true. In fact, I've experienced that with customers I've had over the years. They think that that's kind of the highest level of security. What I want to suggest to you today, and what I hope is a conversation starter or something at least for us to think about, is a different way of thinking about what is DoD level security. This is just a quick sampling, but just in my time in the DoD, we were involved in all sorts of things. I spent most of my time at NSA, and we do a lot of things with communications and signals analysis and things like that. So we had all sorts of abbreviations for all the different aspects and elements. Some of these carry over now into the computer age, technology, internet age. Some don't. But a lot of different things going on, a lot of different activities, a lot of different disciplines. But one of the basic principles, and by the way, none of this stuff that I'm saying is new. I'm talking about DoD level security, and the DoD's been doing it for a long time. So you're going to see things that hopefully are familiar to you. I'm hoping that we talk about them in maybe a little bit different way. Like the basic risk equation. Has anybody seen some form of or is aware of some form of a risk equation where risk is some sort of complicated algorithm, simplified algorithm here that's something to do with all the vulnerabilities you have, all the threats that you have, and you subtract off countermeasures, and that's what you're left with. So, obviously a lot of the business is reducing vulnerabilities or identifying and detecting threats. This all should sound very familiar. If you're going to RSA tomorrow, you're going to see these words all over the place. But at its most basic level, what we're talking about is some combination of this working together to produce risk. And this is a DoD principle. This has been around. I was working on risk equations more than 20 years ago when I was still at NSA. Vulnerabilities. Go around. How many people are going to RSA tomorrow? Anybody? Go around, and if you see a booth where they're talking about vulnerabilities or threats or risk in particular, just go up and ask them what the definition is, how their company defines risk, how their company defines threat, and just see what they say. I'm guessing you'll get some interesting answers, and I'm guessing if you just go different people at the same booth, you may not get the same answer. I find that curious because there seems to be a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of what these words mean in the larger context. I very often hear people sort of interchange the word risk and threat. But in my way of thinking, a threat is a component of risk. It's part of the equation. It's not the same thing. I guess it could be if every other variable was zero, but let's not get too much into the math for now. But vulnerabilities, at its most basic level, it's a weakness. It's something that could go wrong. It's something that is potentially bad. It's something that could potentially be exploited. Back in my day, threat was basically who? It was the people. It was the bad guys. It was nation states like what we call them today. It was our adversary that wanted to do bad things to us, wanted to steal our data, wanted to intercept our communications. Countermeasures is a catch-all phrase for mitigations, detections, anything you do to try to counter the threats and vulnerabilities. And it really all evolved around historically, back in my time, data security. It wasn't about securing the systems. It wasn't about securing the networks. It was about protecting the data. And there's classically, and again, these are not new concepts. Probably a lot of you are familiar with it. There's three ways of affecting or impacting data. It's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You want to steal it, you want to alter it, you want to make it non-available. Think about that in a military context. It's a lot different from what we think about today in the internet world and how we run our businesses and corporations. But there's a basic concept here. It's all about the data security. It's about the underlying what it is that you're all about as a company that you're trying to protect. I used to be a cryptanalyst. I used to work as a manual cryptanalyst. I used to break codes in ciphers. I used to design codes in ciphers. And everybody know what that is? It's a one-time pad. Is it breakable? If you use it correctly, it's unbreakable. You can crank away with, there's no such thing as brute forcing it. We have cryptography today in the internet, and we've heard talks today talking about it. And while the numbers might be large, there's still a computational total number of combinations. There's a way to, if you have the computing power and enough time, you can solve all the cryptography that we have out there today. Not so with a one-time pad. So to my way of thinking, it's been downhill ever since. Those things are slow. We sacrifice security for speed. I should have given a talk on that. So how this talk came about is years ago I was working for one of my PCI customers, may or may not have been the one that I mentioned earlier, and I was explaining cryptography to them. I was explaining encryption. I was explaining why their sensitive data, in this case credit card information, payment card information, needed to be encrypted. And because I'm a cryptanalyst, I had to explain cryptography to them and how encryption worked. And the guy's eyes were getting a little bit glassy, and by the time I was done with my conversation, he said, yeah, but we don't need DoD level security. Fast forward to the last couple years where very large companies have been breached, and we hear almost daily, if not weekly, about another big company going through the breach. I keep hearing that guy say, yeah, but we don't really need DoD level security. And I keep thinking, this is the typical PCI customers. And I keep thinking, yeah, you really do. But I think the reasons why most people think DoD level security doesn't work, and there's probably another half dozen other reasons, but I think these are the ones that I ran into a lot. Probably the biggest one is the amount of money, because you're perceiving that it's additional higher levels of security that's costly. Companies that are selling food, companies that are selling clothing, they don't want to spend all that extra money because they have a profit. They have to make money. They have to earn a profit. They have limited budgets. All these other reasons apply. But as I was saying, my response lately is, yeah, you really do need to consider DoD level security, but not the nth degree, but the way that DoD level security was approached, and that's what I hopefully will convey to you. This is a very sanitized, I hope, network diagram from one of my customers a few years ago. This is a retail establishment. They're showing their corporate office, their data center, showing their typical retail location. They had 2 different versions, and they had hundreds, if not thousands of them. I'll show you my fancy laser pointer here. And the red circles were every system where there was credit card data. Simple, right? Segmentation is a big thing. Scope reduction, that's a big thing on PCI. Not so easy to do in reality. Historically, I think in the commercial world, why a lot of these companies fail, other than they don't want to spend the money, they don't want to invest in the resources and the training, I think they just don't have a fundamental, background, a core competency. I mean, if you think about it, the DoD, the military, has been in the business of national security for hundreds of years. The grocery store that you shop at, the department store, the clothing store, the shoe store, nobody goes to stores anymore, it's all online, right? But the places where you shop and conduct commerce, 20 years ago, they didn't worry about the security that we talk about today because they weren't connected to the internet. They didn't have computers. They did things completely differently. So they don't have the background, they don't have the history, the way, if you think about it, who knows security, who's been doing it longer than anybody? It's the military, it's the DoD. So what can we learn? And again, these are meant to be discussion starters. You can agree or disagree with me, it's okay. I'm just throwing out some ideas based on my years. This is my life history, so be nice because this is my past, but it's okay to disagree with me. Anybody know what movie that is? Sneakers, yeah. Did I mention data security? It's all about the information. In fact, I have the quote here from the movie. There's a war out there, old friend, a world war, and it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think, it's all about the information. So, how many people have some sort of consulting role where you're doing work for other companies? Few. you might experience this, assuming everybody else works for a company and you're trying to make that company more secure. How many people feel like their own company or their customers often don't really get security? Should be just about everybody at some level. Okay. Let's go back to the risk-based model. The biggest difference when you take the risk-based model out into the real world, the commercial world, is you add a value to it, and that's the value of data. Somebody spoke earlier today, and they were talking about the risk equation, and they were talking about coming up with a number value. The number value for the risk-based model for the commercial world is a dollar sign. It's a dollar figure. Think about it. It's all about the money. How much are you willing to risk? How much are you willing to invest on losing the data that you have, whatever company you are? How much is your corporate company reputation worth? For some companies, that's worth a lot, especially somebody tweets and it impacts the valuation of a company because they say something bad about a company. Money matters. Money is what's important. And I'm not convinced that then everything that I'm talking about actually works when it comes down to dollar values. But what's cheap is education, knowledge, awareness, a mindset, thinking about what are we trying to protect and taking a systematic approach to protecting what it is that we're trying to protect. A lot of my customers over the years, even the PCI customers, really didn't fundamentally understand what it was they were trying to protect. They're like, well, I'm the network guy, I'm supposed to keep the network running. I'm the server guy, I'm supposed to keep the operating system patched. They didn't have the big picture. I think everybody in the company needs to have the big picture, and they need to be involved, and they need to know what's going on. Most of you guys are probably familiar with the fact that in the government there's data classifications. Somebody got in trouble because they had an email server that had classified information on it. What was never talked about, and what was an important concept when I was within the DoD, and I'm pretty sure it's still true today, is confidential information isn't as important as top secret information. It doesn't necessarily require the same degree of protection. It doesn't have to be required as long as perhaps top secret information. It expires. It has a life expectancy. And so there's a point where you don't need to protect it anymore. Information can be very valuable for a short time. The analogy that was taught to me many years ago was if you think about a battlefield command, calling in an airstrike, I have to put it in a modern context, calling in a drone strike, the target, that's pretty top secret, highly classified information because you want to have that laser precision. But once the drone has done its thing, does it really matter to protect that data, that command of where the drone was targeting? No, because we kind of know where it was targeting. So very highly classified, but only for a very short time, and then it's useless anymore. There's an approach to data security that's ingrained into the DoD that values data differently depending on what the data is. And I really don't see that in the commercial world. We talk about customers need to have data classification. They have policies that talk about data classification, but it's usually unclassified, or we don't care about it, or it's company confidential. I mean, it's usually a binary. There isn't usually layers. There isn't this set of information is more valuable than this set of information, and we have to protect it differently. And if you think about it, then again, too, from our community perspective, and this is where I start to think we need to have a conversation, is there a way to provide levels of security to the network, to the systems that are dependent on what's trying to be protected? Because we seem to run around breaking things all the time, and everything's broken, and of course, everything's connected, so if you break into one thing, you can pivot and get around to everywhere. And it seems to me there's an argument for segmentation. It seems to me there's an argument for compartmentalization, is what we used to call it. The DoD calls it security in depth, where the very simple concept, whatever is most valuable to you, you put it on the inside, and you have layers of protection. This particular picture is a city in Italy, and it was built, I think, in the 1300s, 1400s. But this concept of layered security is thousands of years old. I mean, how long has there been castles? When was the first fort ever built? It's a very old concept, and it's still used today in a lot of ways. But I never hear anybody talking about one of the premises of this is make it too hard for the adversary to bother. Oh, I'd rather go to the next city where there's only one wall rather than this city where there's 4 walls. I used to make the analogy, everybody that owns a home, they're out in the suburbs, they have to have their home security system, and I always thought it would be good enough to just have the little sign on your front lawn, because you don't really have to have the security system, you just have to fool the bad guy into thinking you do. But a bad guy comes to your neighborhood, he's probably going to be more likely to break into the house that doesn't have the sign. There's another common analogy that talks about you don't have to outrun the bear. If your friends encounter the bear in the woods, you just have to outrun your friends. I've had a lot of customers over the years that have asked, what are our competitors doing? What are our other companies in our industry doing? We need to do as much, no more, no less. Goes back to the dollar figures. But even going back to my early incident that got me started in data security, because I got my wrist slapped, and my boss was apoplectic. I mean, he got red in the face because I did it twice. It was the second time he got mad. But I didn't understand, but slowly it dawned on me. Even though there's components, there's different parts, and this is a physical analogy of protecting paper that's locked in a safe. The safe has a lock on it. That lock is rated. The lock-picking village could probably rattle it off number and verse, but that type of lock, it takes X number of hours to break. That's a measure. And it was in an office that had a lock. That lock was rated and evaluated. How long does it take to get through it? The security guards, they would walk randomly, different floors, different times. And even the guards at the front desk, in the early days, you had to have a badge, and they had to see your picture on it. And then we evolved to proximity badges and things like that. But they had a culture where I worked where they would switch out the security guards on a regular basis, not to give them a break, but they didn't want them to become familiar with the people that were coming through. They didn't want the guards to get facial recognition and just let somebody in. I think that has something to do with social engineering. I think that has something to do with reinforcing you challenge everybody. You look at everybody's badge. You don't see Joe and he comes here every week and you don't know that Joe got fired yesterday. So even the fences were out there, and if you live in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area and you see a building with a fence around it with barbed wire, it's probably DoD. Probably has cameras on it as well as just this perimeter protection. And in some places they might even have sensors on it to detect if somebody touches the fence, and it might need to be fine-tuned to sort of filter out if it's a squirrel or a bird and not a person. I'm just saying hypothetically. I have brought up, in my career, I have learned, and I've tried to teach this to my customers and anybody who will listen, that security, which again is something that I think a lot of my customers believed, is a state that you get to. We just buy this, we just buy this, we just buy this, we're done. No, security is you live a lifestyle, you live a culture. Everybody in your organization is involved and knows what their role is and what they should and shouldn't do, and everybody has a culture of doing this. That's what I used to experience in the DoD. This is almost a 20-year-old slide, and things have evolved. We used to talk about the security life cycle, much like a software development life cycle. We would talk about it in terms of months and years. Nowadays, this life cycle can be hours and minutes because our technology moves so quickly and there's so much data flowing these days. We have new variations on it. I think one of the things that are problematic here, though, is this begins to, and this is where I start to maybe step on toes a little bit, this is very oriented towards the technology. And if you remember, technology is a lot of what we do, but if you go back to what it is you're trying to protect, the data, maybe you take a different approach to the technology. Maybe you think about it a little bit differently. I got to move quickly because we're running out of time. Information about security lifecycle just kind of explains the different steps. And now my random parting thoughts. I think what makes DoD level security hard to implement in the real world is customers, and I think our whole industry, or at least that industry that starts tomorrow down the road, has bought into, don't tell me about all the process and paperwork and policies and training, just tell me what I need to buy to fix the problem. How much is it going to cost? Let me put it in and I'm done. Vendors, because of that, are kind of controlling the industry. The experts have become the ones that are selling you the solution. I think that's a little bit of a conflict of interest, but go take a look at RSA tomorrow and you're going to see it all over the place. And again, I'm not, technology is obviously vitally important, but if you have a more holistic view, you know what your company is about, you know what matters to your company in terms of data, in terms of corporate reputation, in terms of what you're trying to protect. I like to think you start making smarter decisions about what you invest in, and you make smarter decisions about what you need and what you don't need. Anybody know what this is? Rainbow Series. It all started with the Orange Book. I think that came out in the early 80s. I used to have a copy. I think it was classified, so I didn't keep it. And the second book that came out was How to Interpret the First Book, literally. So you've got all that, and most people look at that and say, there's too much going on with DoD. I mean, that's basically a big collection of standards. But I saw this just the other week. Somebody put this out. So this is SANS, I think. These are all the things that if you're a CISO that you have to be smart about and be making decisions on and implementing in your operations. And I haven't read every one of those, but I think every one of them ties pretty much back to a technology solution. So if you're a CISO, you've got to be expert on 1,000 different products, 2,000 if you count all the new stuff that's coming out tomorrow at RSA, and you have to make a decision on whether you need it or not, and really whoever's the best vendor with the best sales pitch very often wins. And that's probably not a good idea. This is a variation somebody put out. Again, I saw this just in the last week or so. All the different cybersecurity domains. And some people were commenting, well, you're missing this, you're missing that. I put this here, I put this here. And my point is simply, wow, that's a lot to know. I mean, there's a lot going on here. I don't think any of us can claim to be an expert on all of this. I know a lot about a lot of that, but there's a lot that I don't know deeply about. Everybody familiar has heard this. People, processes, and technology, those are sort of the three components of security in your organization. My final point is simply, it starts with the purpose. Know what you're doing, know what you're trying to protect, know what you're about. I think we need to move beyond just protect and secure everything because it's all connected and it all has to be treated equally. I think we need to be smarter about what we're doing and why. Little quips that I like to use: technology isn't the solution, it's the problem, so on and so forth. And did I use that word at the bottom of the screen once in this talk? Thank you very much. I didn't say what it is, though. I said I had somebody else put it up there. Any questions or comments? We got about a minute left. Yes?
What's your assessment of having your own equipment to run the cloud going to AWS?
That's too long an answer. I mean, where I come from, you don't use your own stuff. It's always company-owned and corporate-owned, but then this thing called BYOD came along. Moving stuff to the cloud is a lot of what's going to be going on tomorrow. To me, that's passing the buck. You're not necessarily losing your liability, the money part, if something goes wrong, by throwing it over to a third person. We used to talk about, your network perimeter, when we talked about the network perimeter, extends to whoever touches you. If it's a third party, it's the third party. For AWS and those types of companies, read the small print. Know exactly what they're saying that they're going to do for you and what they expect you to do. And don't assume that because they're selling you a magic solution that takes care of all your PCI needs that they really are. Yes? Yep. Yes, I love skiffs. I mean, they sort of did historically when, in the old days before the internet came along, there was a mainframe doing processing and it was in a dark room, it was in a data center and nobody could get in. But start plugging in everything and connecting everything, it's kind of hard to have that concept of a skiff anymore. I think it's more layered protection. I think it's more compartmentalization. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. On behalf of BSides and Fitbit, I'd like to present you with a Fitbit.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. For the two men who gave some questions, here are some electronic badges. Just as a reminder, our next session as well, if there's